Good. Good evening, everybody. I'm Alicia Sams. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics Pritzker Fellows Program, and I am delighted to welcome you all here tonight. Tonight, we are pleased to be hosting a discussion about the state of democracy in the United States and around the world. I can't think of a more important time to have this conversation, and I am really happy that it will be led by our current IOP Pritzker Fellow, Anna Galland, and former Ambassador Patrick Gaspard. They will explore this current precarious moment in time, as well as looking ahead to elections globally. Before we kick off tonight's event, though, I'd like to highlight our final spring quarter event. On Thursday at 5 p.m., the IOP's Student Advisory Board is hosting a conversation focused on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine with UChicago professor Paul Post and the German Consul General of Chicago, Wolfgang Massinger, and others. So please join us for that. I think it's at the IOP. As usual, after tonight's moderated discussion between Anna and Ambassador Gaspard, we will be taking questions from the audience. Please line up behind the microphone that will be placed out here later in the discussion. We'd like to follow our usual policy of giving priority to students for first questions. And also, right now, I'd like to ask you to please make sure your phones are on silent. And finally, sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on everything IOP related, including internships, events, fellow seminars, and more. Now, I would like to introduce Amina Abul-Fatouh, who is going to be introducing our guest tonight. Amina is a second year in the college who is looking to major in political science and economics. Originally from Cairo, Egypt, which I have a soft spot for, Amina is a Fellows Ambassador and team leader for Anna. So please join me in welcoming Amina to the podium.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the event on democracy on the ballot in the U.S. and beyond. Today, we are joined with former U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, Patrick Gaspard, who is the current president and CEO of the Center for American Progress. He is a Democratic Party leader, political director, and has previously served as the executive director on the Democratic National Committee from 2011 to 2013. Prior to which he served as the White House Director of Political Affairs under President Obama. He also spent 9 years as the Executive Vice President of the largest local union in America and served as the President of the Open Society Foundations from 2017 to 2020. Patrick Gaspard has also worked on multiple presidential campaigns, some of which are Jesse Jackson's presidential campaigns and David Dinkins' mayoral campaign, and has continuously worked to shape political outcomes and public policies to ensure a more equitable, legal, political, and economic system in the U.S. We are also joined with current IOP Fellow and former Move On Executive Director Anna Galland, which I am so lucky to be the team leader for her ambassador in the fellow program. She has been a leader in multiple grassroots movements, ranging from the Families Belong Together campaign in 2018 to the American Friends Service Committee in 2002. Anna is an experienced progressive organizer, nonprofit leader, and campaign strategist who has been advancing economic and social justice through multiple avenues for years. The 2022 midterm elections in the U.S. are a defining moment for the future of the country, where economic and social policy are key. But this year, democracy itself may also be on the ballot. In the last year, we have seen the challenges that our democracy has faced from the heightened climate of polarization. Today, we will be discussing the functioning of democracies on a global scale and the way in which domestic and international conflicts impact the health of institutions around the world. So thank you again for joining us today, and please take the opportunity to ask questions and, most importantly, enjoy.
So we have a very small agenda of things to figure out tonight. Democracy in the U.S., around the globe. It's going to be very easy. We'll be done,
no
tidily,
pressure.
Right? Under time. So I've been thinking a lot about the health of our democracy over the course of this quarter when I've been fortunate to be a fellow at the Institute of Politics here. And the threat that feels like it's right in our faces every day is the threat from the MAGA faction, this controlling faction of the Republican Party. This is a faction which is committed to a giant lie about the 2020 election, has been sabotaging nonpartisan administration of elections around the country, subverting confidence in our election system more generally, sanctioning the abuse of executive power. I could go on. There are many things that this particular faction has shown it is willing to do. But other issues, I think, predate and kind of inflame the MAGA threat to our democracy. And I think one of the reasons I was so thrilled to have Patrick join us is that his perspective on the US is informed by his perspective from around the globe about some of those deeper dynamics that have made us so susceptible to this kind of rising authoritarian-ish, should I say, faction in our politics. And so I think as we go into our conversation, one thing I want to really hold up is that the work of democracy building, I think for activists like myself and so many others that I'm in communion with, is a multi-front endeavor necessarily, requires a broad perspective, and will not be solved, right? We're not going to fix our democracy through one court case or one policy paper or one election or one talk, alas. We'll do our best.
Why are we here?
I know. I promised you we'd solve it all. But the downside is it can feel very massive, right? How do we actually build towards the kind of inclusive, healthy, functional democracy that can deliver for people and make their lives better? That feels very vast. And on some days it feels impossibly vast, it feels overwhelming, and it feels like we're off track to achieve it in our lifetimes. And other days it feels like it might be possible. So I wanted to start, Patrick, by asking you whether the glass is half full or half empty when it comes to democracy from your perspective, and to what extent you think about sort of a pessimistic or optimistic take.
Well, thank you for having me here, Anna. Thank you to everyone in the Institute, scholars, young scholars, and older scholars. And thank you all for coming to engage with us on a windswept Monday evening. So really appreciate this. You know, before I get to that question, or as part of it, responding to that question, Anna, would you mind if I push back just a tiny little bit against some of the premises?
Do it, yeah.
In the preamble?
Excellent.
So I actually don't think that the challenge that we have, that the problem that we have is with the MAGA faction that's captured the hearts and souls of the Republican Party. I think that that is an easy story. It's a narrative that we've taken up that has its graphic representation of what happened on January 6th. But there's a long story that predates January 6th, that certainly predates the descent down an escalator by a certain someone who I will not name because that's like saying Voldemort out loud. But it predates 2016. It predates the Tea Party eruption that we had in our politics in 2008 and 2009 following the Great Recession. It goes actually a really long way. I'm less concerned about the MAGA faction of the Republican Party than I am about the radical concentration of capital in the hands of fewer and fewer Americans at the very top. That's driving all kinds of disparities across the country in urban centers, in rural centers, that then gets expressed as a factionalism in our politics, as a kind of zero-sum game in the economy and in legislatures that pits one set of working class folk against another set of working class folk, while at the end of the day, the same body of people who are more than happy to allow the democracy to go off its wheels a little bit, all benefited from the 2017 tax cuts, for instance, which was far more important to them than small d democracy. I'm much more concerned about that element in our politics, the energy it has, how it animates much of public discourse and much of public prescription, and how, at the end of the day, it dominates the spaces where we tell the story as well, because we have to also appreciate that media in America is a commercial enterprise that's, again, driven by the same interests. So I think that that is causing a good deal more of the challenges that we have that gets expressed in the pitchfork brigade that we have on January 6th, or truckers who are lined up first in Ottawa, now apparently outside of Washington, D.C. As well. There's always been this thing that happens in America. It is an old story. The story is old, but it's still good. You always have this kind of populist foment, particularly in moments of singularly challenging economic times. And the foment is told by historians through that story that you just described, and we pay, I think, scant attention to this other challenge. Now, if you want to talk about the MAGA faction, I'm happy to talk about that as well, right? Because
no, we're here to talk about the roots. That's
but even if we talk about the MAGA faction and what happened on January 6th, I want to also pull back and get a little bit of perspective. When you ask me the glass half full, glass half empty question, I mean, you know, if you and I were sitting in Kiev right now, we would think that the glass in the United States is completely full and overflowing, right? So there's like perspective and context for the state and health of our democracy. But even if I look at January 6th and the violent assault that took place, an insurrection that was fomented by the previous occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, if you put that in perspective, there have been other moments of that kind of political violence that's occurred in this country. Sometimes it's been informal, disassociated violence. Other times it's been state-sanctioned violence. I think that we saw state-sanctioned political violence in this town in 1968, right? So I think it's important to just put this all in perspective. I was reading the account of a historian some weeks ago who was kind of giving a sense of the journey to civil war in America in the 1860s. And this historian laid out 70 different instances where there were acts of physical violence in the state capitol, with legislators fighting other legislators or mobs being ushered into the building to pillory, to attack members of Congress and senators. So this is an instance where everything old is new again. And if we, I think, fail to appreciate the carapace that sits on top of that story and its relationship to it, its economic relationship to it, its cultural relationship to it, we make a grave mistake in our assessment and a grave mistake in determining how we get to the other side of it. You know, I have a difficult time separating the queasiness I have in my stomach to the challenges, the state of our democracy, from the queasiness that I hold when I look at the cluster of states in the former industrial heartland of the country, in the Midwest and two in the Southwest, where I look at the collapse of union density. It's about 9 states where like 90% of the loss of union membership in America over the last 35 years is concentrated in those 9 states. And it is connected to, of course, the downward pressure on wages and abandonment of investment in those cities and in their rural counties, and appreciating that every single one of those spaces has now become a purple battleground in the hearts and souls of the democratic future. I can't unpack these things from one another and can't help but appreciate that there's an economic challenge at the heart of it that we underrepresent in how we cover this moment, and the MAGA challenge and the supremacy battle that takes place with people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, et cetera.
Right. I appreciate that you answered
Sorry
that
to
question.
go.
No, it's great. I said, is the glass half full or half empty? And you're like, I'm not sure, but it's full of class, which is a great answer in part. It was a beautiful answer. I want to actually encourage you to draw out, I think something that you also hold in your life experience that I've learned from is the I don't want to say both and, but the kind of full complexity of the way that identities and issues compound. And so when you just spoke of the way that systematic disinvestment in communities in the heartland have fueled a sort of race to, or an openness to,
a race to race?
A race to race, exactly. A race to racism, perhaps. but a race to openness to authoritarians, or would-be authoritarians, or at least a particular vision of a kind of ethnic nationalism in our country. I would just love for you to complicate that a little bit with some of your thoughts on how racism enters the picture, because there is a simplistic story which is not the one you're telling.
I will, but I also appreciate, I think that there are so many similarities to the challenges that we have here, to challenges that we can observe and that have been recorded in lots of other democratic spaces around the popular appeal of all kinds of demagogues in moments of this kind of strife. There's a report issued by Center for American Progress in 2015 that tracked 20 leading democracies over the last 140 years, and it showed that every single time there was a significant economic downturn, that downturn was followed within 5 years by a significant increase in electoral support for parties at the extreme right fringes in every one of those countries, all 20 of them over the course of that 140-year period. So again, everything old is new again. Now, you know, race and economic determinism in this country are joined at the hip. We know that the average Black and Hispanic household in this country has, I think, on average 20% less income and wealth than the average white household in the country, even when you account across the board for both education and geography. So that's like a kind of a stubborn thing. There are, when you adjust for inflation in this country, you will see that the average income of African Americans, when adjusted for inflation, is less today than it was in 1968, the year Dr. King was assassinated, right? That's an astonishing thing, right? It's an astonishing thing to see, and helps you understand all kinds of other dislocations that happen in community as a result of that. But it doesn't begin or end there. If you look across the board at all America, in the last decades, since 1979 to today, we have had a 70% increase in efficiency for American companies, American corporations, but only a 12% increase in real wages from 79 to now. So again, you know, all of this is accruing to the benefit of very small, very narrow elites who have control of resources, agency in outcomes across the board. Unfortunately, in this country, different from others, there is always the shadow, the aspect, the pressure of race in these conversations. If you know your history well, and since I'm at the University of Chicago, I know you all know your history exceedingly well. You're well aware of the history of just brutish racial violence that we've had in this country every time there's been a steep economic downturn. Every single time. You go back to Reconstruction right up through the Great Recession of 2008 to 2010, you understand the correlation that exists between these things and how there's a kind of an inevitability around that contestation that devolves to race. And there's a way that there's a leadership that agitates around this and centers it in discourse. Now we've blown past the dog whistles of the past and we have bullhorns, but that dog whistle's always been there. I'll give you an example of one. One of my favorite examples of race in traditional politics in America. Ronald Wilson Reagan runs for president in 1980. Huge challenges in the economy with inflation just going through. We all know what that looked like in his contest against Jimmy Carter. Where does Ronald Reagan launch his campaign for the presidency in 1980? Do you know?
It was in I can't remember the specifics, but it was basically a dog whistle from around an act of racial violence in the South somewhere.
It wasn't a dog whistle, it was a bullhorn.
Right?
And it was as I mean, you know, Reagan is revered for some interesting reasons. And we think of him as somebody who has considerably more class on these issues than the other guy that is recently in the White House. But Ronald Reagan goes to Philadelphia, Mississippi, where Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were assassinated. And he gives a speech on what? States' rights. That's how he launches his campaign for the presidency. And we all know what the language of states' rights meant in that moment in Mississippi. And to make that speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were killed, said everything about who he was trying to signal to. This was a time when the moral majority was just gaining its legs, the moral majority, which, you know, may as well be the MAGA majority, right? There's like a continuation here. There's a long thread and stream. So there's always been an ability by elites to kind of catalyze that tension that comes from the original sin of American history that they can use to kind of, you know, create fractions and to incubate a base that accrues to their benefit in electoral outcomes, that then accrues to their benefit in economic outcomes.
Just saying, yeah.
Just trying to be real.
No,
I think that
it's
sometimes,
excellent.
you know, we talk about our politics. This is this extraordinary thing. So I'm not born in this country. I'm born in the Congo.
Yeah, I was just going to say, go global. Take it.
My parents are from Haiti.
Yeah.
And my parents both really, my father loved this country. My mother continues to love this country. But my father was really bewildered by politics in America because political debates were always stripped of history. There was no context. You name the subject here. Education, healthcare, war and peace. We debate all of it based on what happened 5 minutes ago in a discussion. And there's almost like this anti-intellectual insistence that we don't invite the scale of history, the scope of history into any of our analysis, forecasting, or prescription. That's not allowed, right? Which is why CRT is a big thing in our politics right now, right? Because we can have the conversation about critical race theory in American politics in a way that's 100% stripped of the previous 150 years of education experience in America. It's an utterly fascinating thing that, of course, you know, benefits certain folk.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the sort of move to both historicize and also the move to understand the U.S. in global context, which is something that also I think we too often forget. Something that I've experienced in sort of movement organizing spaces is that there can be an almost a kind of blinderness here where we think that the U.S. is the only country that's ever had a social movement advocating for change, and that's of course not true. I would love to hear your reflections from either your time as ambassador to South Africa, your time with in doing work advancing democracy around the globe, any lessons that you feel are overlooked or underheard from active social movements in other countries that might be relevant for U.S. social movements to hear in this moment?
God, you asked some big questions. You know, I think that my takeaway every time I have an opportunity to engage with civil society activists, democracy activists, anywhere else in the world, I walk away with this deep sense of urgency for what small d democracy actually means. We were introduced by a young scholar who hails from Egypt, and she will tell you that there is a vastly different definition of what democracy looks like and feels like for young people of her generation in Egypt versus what it looks like and feels like for folks here. And one of the things that I've experienced in countries like Egypt is an understanding amongst activists that's, you know, they don't even have the same kind of fancy language that we have for it here, but there's an understanding that you've got to lead to the defense of the democracy in every instance, not just on issues that are relevant to your community, your constituency, in your narrow lane of activism and organizing, but you have to be engaged in a suite of interventions. Because if you're not engaged across the board, then the ground that you stand on will prove to be incredibly fragile. And that's true of activists working in the independent journalism space that I've encountered, folks who are working in the purely human rights arena, those who are working on the rights of indigenous people in South America, who are walking hand in hand with environmental activists, who are walking hand in hand with those who are investing in economic advancement. And so I've just seen activism have a kind of Swiss Army knife approach to it in those spaces that I think is sometimes lacking in the very highly specialized, very siloed activism that I experience here sometimes and that I find to be less successful as a consequence of that. And sometimes it feels to me as if it's because of a failure of the urgency of it all, right? It's like, if I can just solve this one thing, then we'll be okay. No, actually, it's not just this one thing. It's this suite of things that you have to be prepared to engage on both sides of the barricade.
Yeah, that rings true for sure. And it makes me think a little bit about urgency being connected to stakes sometimes, or people's perception of the stakes. And as we're watching Ukraine, which we've, I think is in the hearts and sort of attention of many of us right now, one particular thing that I've been so struck by is the courage of anti-war protesters in Russia who are marching in a context where, when I've marched against war in my lifetime, I've never worried about whether I'd make it home safely that night. That reflects other aspects of,
It's an astonishing thing to see. It moves me to tears every time I look at it and experience it. And it's not just the folks who are out on the streets demonstrating. Think about somebody like Dmitry Muratov, who ran like the last independent paper in the country, was the co-winner of the Nobel Prize for Peace with my dear friend from the Philippines, Maria Ressa. That man, every single time he steps out of his home and walks into the office or turns on the computer to blast out a set of facts, to push back against the authoritarian narrative, that life is literally on the line. That's an astonishing thing to see. But then you, of course, see those who don't have the blessing of his international recognition, who are anonymous faces, like the older woman who went viral a few days ago because she was stepping right to the faces of Russian soldiers and asking them how dare they go and attack fellow Slavs on her behalf. And this is not representing her and her generation, and her people survived the siege of the city. How could they do this now to another city? Extraordinary thing
so much courage.
To see. So much courage. But you know what? Experience that level of courage so many places around the world. So many. I'm thinking right now, I can almost see this young student named Stanley, who I met in the Congo about 3 years ago, when they had a contested election in the Congo that was, the fix was in, it was completely stolen. It was, one despot handing it off to another, while the international community sanctioned it. The U.S. had, this actually was 5 years ago, it was 5 years ago. The U.S. had its special envoy, somebody I really respect, former Secretary of State John Kerry. The EU had its envoy. Everyone sent, the Carter Center sent people to watch and observe, and of course the election was stolen, and everybody blessed the election, gave it, the papal dispensation, and then on the back end of that, there were young activists like that young man Stanley, who's in my mind, who is no longer alive. He was found in a house that was burned down. He led a student movement in that country, and I remember leaving Kinshasa after a meeting with him and a group of students about this size in the city. And I, remember asking him to take extra precaution, and he said that he could not really take precaution because taking precaution would mean giving an endorsement to the corruption, to the illiberalism, to the violence of the state, and that he had to put his very body on the gears of that machine in order to overcome it, right? And so he was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. Wow. And here, we're not asked to make that level of sacrifice. We're just asked to participate, to interrogate, to hold some values together, and to figure out some way that we can arrive at some kind of an imperfect consensus about our direction, and somehow that seems too great a thing to achieve.
Although you had me thinking there about the ways in which some of us do take different risks or are forced to take more risks by virtue of our identity and place and time. And you certainly, I think, are someone who I'm sure have faced more personal threats than the average bear for the work that you've done.
I've done
over
stupid
your
things.
Time. But I guess what I wanted to ask you was actually exactly where you were going, which is what's really needed from all of us right now. Because one thing that as an organizer I see all the time is people, we all are living our lives, we're dealing with our stuff, we're trying to take care of ourselves and our families, but we also generally, on average, want to do something to make things better, if we can. And the question is, do I see a place where I can be salient, a place where I can put my shoulder to the wheel of history and make what's happening in Ukraine a little better, or what's happening in my neighborhood here a little better. And so often the question that I see from people is, but what am I supposed to do? What's the thing I can do that's impactful? And so I feel like at the micro, that's a challenge, but also at the macro, in this moment, with this turbulent political context that we face.
Can I give the most simplistic answer possible?
Love it, yeah, please.
So I think that the thing that we can all best do is to go and seek out conversation and engagement with people who don't live right next door. I think that we've got to find ways, all of us, to be discomforted in our politics. There's a tremendous amount of comfort in movements that I'm privileged to engage in, and there's the conviction that we are right and they are all terribly wrong. And we try to build from the space of our righteousness. And I think that's an altogether simple thing to do. And it is, but I think building from our place of righteousness is exclusionary. And I think at the end of the day, it is the thing that is that tears us down. Coming up as an organizer, involved in global issues, involved in community issues, I didn't see a distinction between the two things, but I thought that each of them demanded from me a real rigor. I could not just go out and yell my case, but I had to go out and have a conversation about the kind of world that I hoped to be able to build, establish, ensure into the future. And that required me to be studious about the things that I believed in, but it also required me to have a set of antennas and to be receptive to argument and to debate. And I'm finding increasingly, as I continue to try to do this work, I find less and less space for that level of engagement. So sure, there are lots of things that all of us who believe strongly in a particular issue can do in joining an organization, making contributions, delivering petitions, going and demonstrating against one member of Congress or another at whichever yacht you want to choose. There's all that kind of stuff that folks do all the time in any organization we will direct you to do, but not enough organizations will direct you to actually go and try to engage with people who are not in easy alignment, not in easy agreement with you. And that's actually what we need a whole heck of a lot more of.
It's so interesting because that, in a way, is a different tack than the move to go local, which is another tack that I've seen people taking, especially in the wake of the failure of comprehensive democracy reform in the last year. I think, and in the
can you
wherever
sit in
we
that?
are. What's that?
Sit in that though, but go local, but go local in a way where let's take. And we had this conversation in the seminar that we had before this. Let's take the peach state. Let's talk about Georgia for a second. So, if you pay any attention to the architecture of the U.S. Senate, you understood that there was no way on God's green earth the Democrats were going to manage to overcome the filibuster, because there's a certain senator from the state of Arizona and a senator from the state of West Virginia.
I noticed you're not using names here.
I
see you.
Yeah. I used to be a diplomat. But there was no way that they were going to vote for overturning the status quo of the filibuster. Some of us have known this for more than a minute. So if you appreciate that there is no way to overturn the filibuster and therefore no way to pass meaningful, comprehensive voting rights reform at the national level, you have to go local and you have to go do what Dr. King did there's this great interview with Dr. King, 1963. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize, comes back to America, is going to do the march, everything. And a reporter says to him, you just won the Nobel Peace Prize. My God, what do you do next? And Dr. King said, well, I'm going to go to the place where there's the greatest pain, and I'll see if I can be of some use. So since we can't fix this at the national level, go to the place of greatest pain. Go to Georgia with its reprehensible history of exclusion. Recognize that in the state of Georgia, if you're African American and you live in a majority black voting precinct, you're going to wait on average 50 minutes to an hour to vote. If you're white in Georgia and you live in a majority white precinct, you're going to wait 6 minutes to vote. It is cooked. It is baked into the system. But if you're going to go local, what you have to do is figure out how to organize with folk who are in the 50-minute precincts and the 6-minute precincts. And you got to figure out how to appeal to the folks who are in the 6-minute precincts to help them understand that it is to the better good of themselves, their children, their grandchildren, to kind of even the stakes here and not make it about whether or not someone's going to vote for Stacey Abrams or not for governor, but appealing to just like a basic, fundamental sense of equity that I think it's possible to arrive at some kind of consensus around. I'm 100% confident of that because I've had to do it in really tough places on issues that it seemed as if it was impossible to get alignment on. But it was before the age of social media. It was before Move On. Before emails even, at a time when if you wanted to pass anything or do anything, you had to get up out of your home and actually go and knock on somebody's door and talk to them about their vision for themselves, their families, their community, your vision, and to see if you could kind of meet somewhere in between on these things. And that's a lost art that I hope we can kind of reconstitute.
Yeah, well, and maybe it's not as stark a contrast as I implied in the sense that going local, there are people in my own family, on my block, in my neighborhood, in my city, that surely I have deep disagreements with. But part of the practice, I think, of small d democracy is figuring out how to stay in relationship together through that profound disagreement and finding ways. There was a period when it was very popular, at least on Facebook. Am I supposed to admit that I'm still on Facebook? But on Facebook, it was popular to unfriend someone if they had done something that you disagree with politically. And I remember thinking, if you need to do that to protect your own mental health or well-being, I totally get it. In general, that should be a last resort because we actually need to be in contact with each other to work through those kinds of conversations that, as you're noting, can be very uncomfortable and may not be unlocal. They might actually be very close, right?
That's right.
We need to work it through.
That's right. It feels as something old has died in the world and we haven't figured out what the new thing is, and we have to take a minute to pause. Can I be like totally nerdy for a second?
Bring it. I mean,
so
can we be nerdy? Is that acceptable here? Okay. I heard a small cheer.
There's a book I read a long time ago that had a profound impact on me. It's written by this Belgian writer, Marguerite Yourcenar. She wrote it in, I think, 1951. She's sitting in a Europe that's been ravaged by World War II. The old world is dead, right? The old European powers are dead. There's this strange America that just dropped an atomic bomb. Seems like it's going to be the new power in the world. She's thinking back to the old Roman Empire when Rome won the Second Punic War in 210 BC and suddenly becomes like the hegemon, right? She's thinking about that moment and she's like fast forwarding in the history and she starts to write a story about Emperor Hadrian, who was the first emperor at a time when the majority of Romans no longer believed in the gods but hadn't figured out what this new religion was yet. And Hadrian famously wrote these diaries where he's writing these letters to his successor, his nephew, Marcus Aurelius, and he's saying to him, like, this old world is dead. We don't know what this new thing is. And in times when the old gods are dead, people are susceptible to be captured either by hope or by fear. And you, Marcus Aurelius, my nephew, you're going to have to figure out how you lead people in this moment. And I'm hoping, young man, that by reading all these letters that I'm sending to you, you're going to orient people towards the sense of aspiration and affirmation, right? So for me, this is a moment where the old gods have indeed died, right? What we call the norms, right? The norms that we insist existed once. The norms are dead. There's a new world that's running at us, and that new world is running at us in a house of horrors that is the way we communicate with one another, or just with ourselves these days through our algorithms. And we have not yet determined what democracy looks like on the backside of that. We have to make a new democracy for the new information age that we're in right now, and we haven't figured it out yet. But we have to be intentional about it and cognizant that indeed something has fallen in the world, and we better decide in a hurry what it is that we intend to erect in its place.
So we're going to build. I thought you were going to say, there's a quote by, I think, the Italian philosopher Gramsci. I bet I'll get checked here if I get this wrong, which is that the old world is dying and the new world is being born. Yet being born, here be monsters.
Yeah, Gramsci stole it from Hadrian.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, he made his own version.
I feel like we're really nailing the U Chicago vibe right now. I don't know. I'll hazard to say.
I like to go to the antecedents.
All right, that you just delivered, Patrick. I thought that's what you were going to say, but I think it's consistent, and I feel like that call, are you going to be, what was it, will you be captured by fear or will you be captured by hope? That's a beautiful distillation of the challenge that we face in a moment where many of the kind of known and comfortable modes of how we do politics in this country are kind of falling before our eyes, and it feels like a more dangerous era. So the idea of holding on to hope in an era that feels dangerous is something that I'm interested in. You have worked in many different contexts that, as we discussed before, that were perilous for the activists, elected officials, civil society advocates. And I guess I just wonder how you have held on to your own hope when you've observed friends, comrades, allies really not making it, which you have. So maybe a note of hope against the odds, and then in just a few minutes we're going to move to question and answer. So if people have, or question and dialogue, I don't think we have definitive answers for some of the things we're opening up here. We have intuitions and discussions.
So I hold on to that sense of hopefulness two ways. One, is to always be clear about the arc, the context, the moment that we've arrived in, with some comparative analysis of where exactly it is that we have come from. I like to hold on to the stories of particular Americans or others around the globe who put it all on the line in order to achieve something greater than themselves. Right? So there are constant, endless examples of that. The one that I hold on to and push out everywhere is the example of the greatest American ever, Frederick Douglass, who's emancipated and then participated in the emancipation of his entire people. I hold on to the example of an organizing story that I love. My favorite organizing story is of a conversation that took place in the Oval Office between Franklin Roosevelt and A. Philip Randolph, who was the great union organizer, African-American, who led the Pullman Porters in this country. A. Philip Randolph heard Franklin Roosevelt campaigning for the presidency. Roosevelt comes into Randolph's state and talks about what he's going to do to desegregate the armed services in America. Randolph says, this is my guy. He goes out, he organizes for Roosevelt to be elected. Roosevelt wins. And then after he's won, Roosevelt never again mentions the desegregation of the armed services. A. Philip Randolph gets irate. He starts agitating against this. He tries to see the new president, and all the gatekeepers block him. Finally, a year into the presidency, he realizes, oh, I ought to go see the real president. He goes, he visits with Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt marches him across to the Oval Office. And A. Philip says, hey, I campaigned for you. I raised money. I got black folks out. You've done nothing on this desegregation bill. And Roosevelt says to him, well, I'll do it the moment that you make me do it. A. Philip says, what do you mean? And Roosevelt said, well, the moment I look outside the Oval Office windows and I see thousands of people marching by demanding that I desegregate the armed services, I can then point to the folks in my party, the Dixiecrats, who are against this, and tell them, I got to do it, too much pressure. The politics call for it. And so A. Philip Randolph says, I get it. He goes out. He starts organizing what would have been the first march on Washington. And on the eve of thousands of people descending upon Washington, D.C., Roosevelt convinces the others, and they're like, okay, we're going to make a commission to study the desegregation of the armed services, and it eventually happens under Truman. But I tell that story because I draw hope from that because A. Philip Randolph was able to see the long arc, right? There's like a conviction he had. There was something he wanted to get done. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He had to organize in community. He had to figure out ways to be in a comfortable relationship with power that he detested in many ways, power that had caused great pain to him and to his community. He gets into a relationship with it. He's discomforted by it, and then realizes how the politics work, and then he manages to overcome that. And here's the kicker for him, and to get all kinds of collateral benefit along the way, because he doesn't just organize what would have been the March on Washington. He organizes people into the Union to build up the Pullman Porters, their stature, and gets integrity in outcome along the way for them on a number of really key important state-based measurements. So I'm always holding on to those kind of historic stories to help me as a compass to appreciate that history didn't just start 5 minutes ago. And then I hold on to the sense of celebration. Frederick Douglass, A. Philip Randolph knew how to celebrate victory in the moment. They could keep their eyes on a North Star, but calibrate how they were going to get there and bring others along with them in the sweep of that history by being clear about the momentous achievements that even getting 70 people, 80 people in a room on a cold, snowy Monday night actually means in the ripple of hope that you're trying to send out into the world.
Love it. We've talked a lot about the discipline of hope in our seminar this quarter at U of Chicago, and I feel like what you just said is resonant with that, this idea that in tough times and challenge, in the face of overwhelming obstacles, it actually takes work to hold on to your vision and to celebrate progress along the way. And so that's what we're going to work on doing together. Let's just do that, shall we? Have some discipline of hope in these tough times. And now we will actually move into questions or prompts for discussion. I think there's a preference for students to come forward first if you do have any questions you'd like to bring. And if not, we'll keep riffing.
We'll just keep talking.
Yeah, so.
There are so many great stories, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I got to serve for 3.5 years in Nelson Mandela, South Africa, after having first met Mandela in 1991, when he just 1990, when he was just released from Robben Island, and I met this man who had been in captivity for 27 years, and he managed somehow to
Speaking of the discipline of hope.
Talk about the discipline of hope, right? Like he created a people's parliament in jail and trained his cadre with this bizarre sense that somehow they were going to govern their country one day. I mean, what on earth? Who on earth could hold some notion of hope like that for 30 years, given the state of the world as he went into that jail? So many extraordinary examples in front of us, epic examples, and the small examples that are being set in Chicago today.
Thank you. We have a question.
Hi, my name is Malia Allen. I'm a third-year student in the college studying political science. My question for you guys is really just like a question of asking for advice. So I feel like one thing you highlighted a lot in this discussion was that you need to reach out and to promote democracy, small d democracy. You need to have conversations with people who disagree with you. You need to be uncomfortable. And like I definitely agree that was a really good point. But I feel like recently there's been a lot of people who, well, I'm happy to discuss differences in like economic policy or whatever, something that Congress is working on passing, but there are a lot of people nowadays that like their disagreement is not with an issue, but it's with something that is directly my livelihood, my existence, or the livelihood and existence of my friends and family, people I really care about. And so I was wondering if you had advice for approaching those types of conversations with people who maybe like, as a non-binary individual, as a person in like in the LGBTQ community, like what do you do when you're faced with someone who maybe their issue with you is that you exist?
So first thing I say is to make sure that you get yourself out of any space of potential harm, right? So when I said to Anna before that I've done some dumb things, I have put myself in situations I can think of a number of times where I made foolish decisions to put myself in circumstances that could have caused me irreparable harm, and I recommend against it. So first thing is to make sure that you're in a that you can have physical safety. Really important if you're serious about being an organizer, if you're serious about activism. Second thing I'd say is you have to recognize that people like that have existed in our communities, in our country, in our world for time immemorial, and will continue to exist well into a future when you and I are no longer on this planet. And recognizing that should compel you to actually figure out ways to go find values, find consensus in spaces where that's available to you, where it's available to you, where it's available to me. It's not available in all spaces, and there are some folks who would rather burn the house down than allow you to live in that house with some dignity. They'd rather burn the entire building down. They'd rather burn the block down. They'd rather burn their own house down than to allow you to live in dignity in your corner of it. And you have to recognize that and appreciate that you have to go and do everything you can to make them the minority. Please don't take my encouragement to be discomforted as some notion that you have to, one, put yourself in danger, or two, that you have the ability to persuade those who live in violent opposition to your very existence.
Can I add one thing? Thank you for bringing that question and for just what you're doing in the world. I feel like it's been helpful for me to understand over time that not everyone has to carry every load at all times. That sounds obvious, but sometimes it doesn't feel obvious. And that someone who's most directly harmed by the existence of a particular structure is not the first person that we should be collectively pushing forward saying, you go fix it.
Yeah,
and so
that's
there's a place and a time for solidarity, that is to say, as the shorthand. And that's one thought. And then the other, just quick note, something that I've been playing with in conversation with students here, I think is, I'm someone who believes deeply in the power of the value of empathy. So for all of us to live together and survive and thrive, we need to be able to see past our own specific experiences and see ourselves in other people, see our own kind of interests as bound up in other people's. But there's a limit to empathy in the sense that you have to have a power analysis in your empathy, right? Like, I shouldn't be empathizing with the person who's holding me imprisoned, for example, or I can, but it's a particular form of empathy. So I guess I just want to encourage us to find our way to a kind of fierce empathy that has a power lens on it, so that as you're doing your work, you're not pushing yourself in a kind of unaware way to just like connect with every person in every moment and every time. We can be sophisticated in how we build alliances and relationship.
Can I give you a very practical example of an experience that I had recently? So back in, I guess it was in October. I can't keep track of the world anymore during this pandemic. But, back in October, we all saw horrific images of, the world saw horrific images of Haitian migrants and refugees who were at the Texas border, who were being chased down, hunted by riders on horseback who work for our government, who you pay, who we all pay, right? It was a horrific thing to see. The day after seeing that image, 2 days after seeing that image, I took a plane and a long car ride to the border of Del Rio and went to be in communion and solidarity and to just bear witness to what was occurring at the border with those Haitian migrants. I went with some faith-based leaders, civil rights leaders, and we were met, after we spent time with the migrants, we were met by folks who looked like they were straight out of central casting for January 6th. They were in full SWAT regalia. They had their armor on. They were all strapped, and they were confronting us. And they were not law enforcement, let's just say, but they looked as if they were. And it was like this violent moment, and we understood that we had to get out of that circumstance, right? And as we did, though, we then took it upon ourselves to go and engage with other folks in the town of Del Rio And we found that even though there was this like violent group of people who were ready to do harm to us, there were others there who were really concerned, really anxious about the border being overrun, about these migrants, these refugees coming across the border into their community. And there were some of them who used language that was really problematic. However, I could engage with them because they had like this level of empathy that you could crack through, this level of grace that could be extended. I saw families in Del Rio who wanted that previous president to build that damn wall, and who think that we should not have any refugees who look like that. They'd be fine taking in Ukrainian refugees. They just didn't want those refugees. But I saw them go and deliver food to those migrants and to those refugees. I saw them extend a grace that I thought would give me an opportunity to go and have a conversation with them about where these folks were fleeing from, what they were experiencing, what they aspired to, and it felt as if connections were made. So for me, that was a perfect example of being in a space where there were some folks who there's no ability to persuade, and they just want me basically dead, and others who one could find some kind of common space with, even while they were in disagreement with me about border policy.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi again, I'm Amina, second year in the college, and Anna's team leader for the Fellows Ambassador program. And so firstly, thank you guys so much for having this conversation. And one thing I realized when you were talking about risks of political advocacy, and one thing I see as an international student, is the way in which political climates can impede the ability to have this advocacy and change. And I was wondering if you guys could speak about the tensions that hinder this advocacy. I mean, even as someone from Egypt, every single time I have a conversation about politics, I have to remind myself that this is okay, this is the whole point, there's nothing wrong with having this conversation. And so something I see is that a lot of people might view democratic change or any sort of revolutionary change as a privilege and instead of a right. And I was wondering if you could speak about those tensions.
I'm going to let you take this. This
is a deep question.
The seminar leader. But, you know, can I just, because I am going to put the pressure on you on this one, Anna, but can I just say something? As you told your story, I had goosebumps because I live it. So my mother has been in this country now for 50 years. And yet there isn't a single time when there's not a single time when I'm on television talking about politics where I don't get a text from my mother, be careful, you can't say these things, you can't do these things, because she came up in authoritarian spaces. Her brother was killed, literally killed, disappeared for participating in politics. So 50 years after being in this country, my mother still thinks of it as a space where where the environment cuts against that kind of freedom of expression, kind of a powerful thing.
You made me think of the story, actually, just while you were speaking there. I have 3 kids. My youngest kid is almost 6. He was born in March 2020. And when I was about 2 or 3 days from going into labor, the previous president, whose name shall not be mentioned, according to the rules of our stage, began talking about the organization I was leading, Move On, from the podium of his various campaign events, which meant that the name Move On went into circulation on Fox, which meant that threats of physical violence to myself and my family and my colleagues in my organization went through the roof. And I don't know if any of you have ever been trying to get ready to go into labor, but that's not the ideal condition for humans to go into labor. You're supposed to crawl into a dark, quiet cave somewhere and be very safe and very off the social media grid. But I offer this by way of saying, my experience in that moment was, man, this work that I believe in so deeply has suddenly become dangerous to myself and my family and people that I love. And I am profoundly committed to my work, and it did not stop me, and I've continued it and will continue it in my life. And it gave me some tiny little taste of the kind of politics we want to stay away from, where expressing your opinion, organizing, raising your voice, building organizations and institutions becomes something that can be dangerous. I would like to make our politics undangerous again. And it's never been undangerous for some, I want to be very clear, but for the majority of our sort of last 10 years, let's say, people could engage in rallies, organizing, and protest without fear for themselves or their families. And I think we really have to be clear that we're in a period of the temperature rising, and that's a real problem. And again, part of what I think all of us are called to is to do the kind of sort of work together of reinvesting in democracy itself, in the art of connection and retaining relationships with each other across lines of profound disagreement while we go and actually improve conditions for people's lives. Because if we don't, I think this is the kind of an aspect of the dystopian politics that none of us wants to create here. I don't know if that answers your question, but it does say to me that I would like for all of us to feel not just safe, but encouraged in participation.
But there's, we know there's danger all around us in our traditional American politics. If you were
Right.
a young African-American activist engaged in the uprising in Baltimore following the execution of Freddie Gray, you experienced a tremendous amount of state-sanctioned violence in your life by showing up for peaceful demonstrations and having your body beaten down. If you are an abortion provider now in Texas, you're engaging in work that the state of Texas invites violence into your life over. Right, so these things are present here and certainly present in so many other parts of the world where we have to draw strength and encouragement in resilience and resistance.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Annie Henderson. I'm a first-year student at the Hair School. My question is really to you, sir, which is, as an ambassador, you are working within a system and you're working as the face of a system that you don't necessarily agree with, every detail. And I'm sure there are loads of policy areas where your work still has to support things you don't necessarily believe in. And so I'm kind of curious, how do you think about working within a system and with the understanding that you're going to be in some ways aiding things that you don't necessarily believe in?
What a great question. So I will tell you that in my time serving as an ambassador on behalf of this great nation, there wasn't a single day in my ambassadorship where I wasn't always really, really proud of our American experiment and everything that we ascribe to, everything that we achieve every single day. But there were also many, many, many days where you're right, I was in disagreement with policy. I'll give you just a small example of one. I don't believe that a nation that has the economic degradation that exists in Malawi and that has the authoritarianism that exists in that country, I don't think that nation should be spending the material wealth of its people in purchasing military aircraft from the United States. Just really don't. Lots of reasons why that should not be the case, why they shouldn't be buying F-16s, and many reasons why I don't believe that in our tradecraft, our foreign service officers should be about the business of promoting the purchase of F-16 by countries that have the GDP that those nations have, and have all kinds of other democratic challenges. So yeah, I could think of many, many, many examples. I will tell you that what served me well in those instances was the ability to hold in my mind clarity that there are no perfect nations. There are no perfect nations at all on this earth. Every democracy has naked contradictions inherent in it every single day, that's present in its communities, in its churches, in its legislative bodies. and that the people of those democracies, if they're true democracies, and there's the opportunity for petition, for agitation, and for self-correction on the part of that government, the people of those democracies have an obligation to serve to their best of their ability on both sides of the gates, either where necessary to stand up resistance to policies, or in service in that government in ways that holds on to this notion of servant leadership and public service activism. So I always held for myself the notion of achievement, the complication of imperfection, the challenge of serving on behalf of a hegemon, and what that means in different places in the world, and a determination to always carry a radical honesty into conversation. So I have like this kind of 8 Mile approach to politics and diplomacy. You know what the movie 8 Mile with Eminem? All right, so
I love that this is where we're going to get close to ending the event. We know we've hit the mark.
So this is the story I hold on to in politics, and the strategy I hold on to. So, and spoiler alert if you ever intend to watch 8 Mile with Eminem. So, Eminem is the protagonist. Early in the movie, he's in a rap battle, and he just blows it because he's getting disrespected by the other guys. He doesn't know how to make a comeback. He chokes, can't perform. The entire movie shows you how he lives, like, poor trailer. It's just awful circumstances. Get to the end of the movie, and he's made it a chance for redemption. He's going to be in a rap battle again against the person who beat him in the beginning of the story. And he decides, oh, I know how to beat this guy. I have a strategy for him. He shows up, and he gets to rap first. And what does he do? He tells on himself. He says, yep, that's right. My family's poor trash in a trailer. Yeah, my friend shot himself. Yeah, my mom's on welfare. Yeah, this, that. Yep, I can't even read or write. Yep, he tells all about himself. And then he hands the mic off to his opponent. And the opponent has literally nothing to come back with. So in politics and in diplomacy, I subscribe to the 8 Mile theory of the case with a kind of radical honesty about who I am, where I come from, and where I think the collective we come from and where we are. So in every audience that I ever was in a public setting, and this would discomfort the foreign service officers who worked with me, in every audience in South Africa, I would tell on myself. I'd say, yep, this is the challenge in America today. Yes, we have this small percentage of folks who control 80% of the wealth in our country. Yes, these are the specific things that have happened in the racial history of our country. Oh, stolen elections? Huh, let me tell you about Kennedy Nixon and what happened in Illinois and Texas. Like, I was always forthright about laying out that history and then being clear on where I hoped we were all rowing towards as a democracy. I would talk openly about some of the policy challenges that I thought we had that were creating real difficulties in other places in the world. I would talk about the American destabilization, the role that America played in destabilizing whole swaths of the Sahel and the challenge of Libya as a result of our inability to follow through on our vision there. And then after that, I would try to figure out what the common ground was around the shared hopes and values of our two countries, or if I was in a multilateral space, of our multilateral approach. So in all things, in politics and in diplomacy, I think that radical honesty is necessary. Otherwise, the contradictions and the hypocrisy will overwhelm any opportunity for progress.
Okay, we're down to our last question. We're so pleased to end.
Sorry to give such a long response.
No, it was excellent. We got to do it. 8 Mile. You worked in 8 Mile. How are we not going to do that? Okay.
Took my one shot.
Hi, my name's Robert Johnson. I'm a second year at the law school. Thank you for being here. So my question kind of deals with two claims that you made during the talk about these sort of...
Oh, no, I made claims. He's going to use my words against me. He's a lawyer.
But these sort of two kind of inevitabilities when we have periods of economic contraction, that's the fomentation of right-wing populism and then also exploitation of kind of racist sentiments and anxieties. Where does the history of kind of leftist populism play into that analysis? And then also, given the inevitability of that second portion, the exploitation of racial anxieties, what do you make of what seems like a resurgence of black nationalist movements and also just efforts by minority communities to kind of contract, pull in, and build their own sort of spaces to maybe combat that inevitability?
Those are great questions. Those are really hard.
I know, and we're almost at time, so you're going to have to be...
Oh, I have to be super quick? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, Frank.
That's a pressure, and that gets me out of...
Fully answering.
So on the first one, I'd say that it comes from the same space. So times of downward economic pressure leads to easy, simplistic solutions in Budapest and in Peoria. Right? There's a grasping, the best example of this is National Socialism in Germany and Adolf Hitler. If you just look at the policies, right, that ushered Hitler into power, you'd say a lot of it is what you would describe as left-wing populism. It's like an economic populism from with a left-wing orientation and bent, with this notion of inclusion that stirred support for that party then, and there are countless other examples. I could give you ancient examples and modern examples of both, going back to Gracchus and the plebes in Rome. So I think the left-wing extreme populism also surfaces in those moments of economic tension and and degradation. On your second question on this nascent nationalism, it never really seems to go away. There's there's a wonderful arc of nationalism that you can trace in black aspirational politics from Reconstruction right through to this new moment that we're in right now. Sometimes it took the form of going back to the motherland. Other times it takes the form of reinventing the motherland in this space. Other moments it hangs on social outcome. Other times it's all about economic determinism, right? So it just never goes away. The story changes for each era, each generation, and takes on new contours. Unfortunately, this is the thing that gets me, there's little learning that takes place from one moment to the next in it. And I think that a narrowing kind of nationalism can be a powerful thing if it's about building institution as opposed to being about excluding others from a space of movement, right? I think the most famous example in black nationalist politics about that tension and that debate is Malcolm X's debate with himself about inclusion versus exclusion. There's that famous scene in his autobiography and, of course, in the Spike Lee movie where he gives a talk at Columbia University and he's exiting out and a very enthusiastic white student has listened to him and says, Mr. X, how do I help? What can I do? And he looks at her and says, nothing. And he walks off. And then later, he comes to regret that moment, right? He says, there's a way that we can stand up our own thing, but still manage to be connected to other movements, be in solidarity with other movements, because that does not diminish from our intent, but actually could give strength to it over time. And we have to recognize that the enemy is the same enemy. So I could say a lot more about that. I wish we had time to, because I gave you kind of an unsatisfying response. So hope we have a chance to pick that up.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, I think there's lots more to discuss. We could talk about the asymmetries of populist movements on the right and left. We could talk about much more from your life history, Patrick, which is so full already, even before you got to the work you're doing now. We'll put a pause on those threads for the moment, and we'll just say thank you so much to University of Chicago for hosting this conversation, for welcoming Patrick here. We're so glad you were able to take the time and be with us. And thanks to the amazing students here who are going to carry the work forward. We look forward to figuring out how to build a durable multiracial democracy where everyone has a place of honor and dignity together. Can I do a little like movement, kind of like rally and cry on the stage, or is that too much? Yeah, I know, we'll do the farmer's clap. Thank you again. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Appreciate you. I love that you went for the farmer's clap.